They sat on the floor, across from one another, in the heart of a cavernous room beneath the rubble field complex. Here, though the perimeter of the room was stone, the internal walls were thin metal, divided into slats that folded and slid along runners in the ceiling. With those walls, the huge room could be divided into any number of smaller chambers of almost any shape. At the moment, the subroom was an almost perfect oval. "I assume I don't need to tell you," Tezzeret began after several moments of silence, "just how potent a tool telepathy can be to an organization such as mine." "No," Jace said with a faint grin. "I think I can figure that much out on my own." "Excellent. You've passed the not a raving imbecile test. What I don't understand," Jace said, "is why you don't already have access to such powers. I know my talents are rare, but they're not that rare, are they?" "You wouldn't think so," Tezzeret admitted, "but you'd be surprised. In all my years, I've come across only 2 mind readers other than yourself. One of them is dead, and the other, well, isn't available for employment. But I've tried building a great many devices," the artificer said, refusing to be interrupted again. "Tools to accomplish what I and my agents cannot. They, too, came up short. I built 2 crowns of Ethereum." "Ethereum?" Jace repeated. Tezzeret clenched his jaw at yet another interruption and held up his artificial hand. "Ethereum. A powerful, magic-rich alloy capable of holding any manner of enchantments. It's also exceedingly rare, since the secret of its creation is all but lost across the entire multiverse. This hand is probably more valuable than the entirety of this district." Jace's eyes widened. "As I was saying then," the artificer continued, 2 crowns of Ethereum, one of which should have allowed me to read the thoughts of anyone wearing the other. We managed to communicate, speaking as though we were right beside one another across a distance of miles, but I could never read any thought he didn't choose to project. I constructed a sarcophagus of needles and tubes into which a subject could be placed. I managed to extract the equivalent of 2 words worth of thoughts before the machine turned the subject's brain into so much gargoyle guano." Jace shuddered. "I even once fashioned a crystalline chamber," Tezzeret reminisced, eyes glazing slightly, "capable of storing the memories and personality of a dying man. But the mechanism that should have allowed communication with the mind within failed to work, and since I'd built it purely for communication, I hadn't included any means of placing him into a new living body, so I've no idea how much of him was actually preserved." "My point," he concluded sharply, coming back to himself with a sudden blink and glaring at Jace as though somehow he were at fault for the digression, "is that, though it comes so easily to you, and though it's a form of magic wizards have been struggling to develop for ages, it's actually proven to be a very rare and very elusive talent. And that means that we've got to get you, Bellerin, as skilled as we possibly can." "I can live with that," Jace said with a fierce grin. "I'm so glad to hear it. Talk to me." "What?" "Talk to me." Tezzeret leaned forward, fist on the table. "Not with your mouth, with your mind." For an instant, Jace stared. Tezzeret wasn't certain if he was concentrating or had somehow failed to understand the command. Then, "Like so?" His words formed directly in Tezzeret's mind. Jace's lips, his tongue, his teeth moved not at all. Precisely like that, Tezzeret told him. I see you've done this before. It's come in useful a time or two. How far? Jace shrugged. Never tried it beyond a few yards or so, he said aloud. We'll have to test that. He pointed a metal finger at the door. There are several guards in the hallway outside. Can you communicate with them? I've never tried this for outside line of sight, except with people I already know. Then now's a good time to start. A moment more, and Jace's eyes grew wide, his jaw muscles twitching as though he were repressing a shout. And then the door flew open and a trio of guards dashed inside with the clatter of mail, hands reaching for their swords. The room abruptly smelled of oiled steel. Boss? One asked. Is everything all right? I thought I heard someone shouting for us. And you? Tezzeret demanded of the other two. Both shook their heads. Heard nothing, boss. It's a start. Tezzeret pointed to the first guard, though he'd turned back toward Jace. Can you include him and me both? What? Can you talk to both of us like this? Jace frowned, felt his fists clenching. I'm not sure. Tezzeret glanced at the guard, who nodded. I heard him, boss. Excellent. The young mage was tiring swiftly, in mind if not in muscle. The sensation was like trying to juggle two balls in different directions. And then his entire body slumped when Tezzeret pointed to another guard. All three of us now. It took Jace half a dozen tries before the second guard also heard his mental voice. His entire forehead was drenched in sweat. His mouth had gone dry as a mummified bone, and his vision was starting to blur. Tezzeret and the guards were starting to look as fuzzy as their reflections in the steel walls. No, he shook his head, a bad idea, as the world spun around him, as Tezzeret pointed to yet a third guard. Tezzeret, I can't, You are not giving up already, Tezzeret shouted, face slowly going red. I won't allow it. But I... Do it! Damn you, Bellerin, do it now! Jace cast out his voice to encompass all four men. His head felt as though it would split open, like someone had stuck a pry bar through his skull and was steadily working it this way and that. Pathetic, Tezzeret said, rising to his feet. Yet despite his tone, he reached out and helped Jace to sit back against the wall, rather than leaving him curled on the floor. I expect better of you, Bellerin. I know you're capable of more than this. He turned to the nearest guard, even as he rose. Once he's recovered, he's not to leave until he's proven to you that he can at least still reach three of you. I want to know, and I want him to know, that pain and prior failures aren't going to hold him back or undo what we've accomplished. You've got it, boss. And then the artificer was gone, leaving the guards to stare at Jace, shuddering not merely with pain, but with the shame of his first failure. Jace lay upon the thick down mattress, arms crossed behind his head, and stared up at the ceiling, just as he had for many hours across the span of many days. And he wondered, not for the first time, if Tezzeret's notion of an exciting life was perhaps different from his own. Oh, he had his training sessions to look forward to. They weren't anyone's definition of fun, and he might have thought seriously about leaving after that first one, except that they worked. Damned if, in mere days, he hadn't felt his mind expanding, comprehending spells he'd never used before, honing even familiar incantations like a razor's edge. But those sessions were sporadic, occurring when Tezzeret had the time to devote from his many other concerns on many other worlds, and Jace was getting more than a little bored. The Consortium's Ravnica compound was, or so Tezzeret had claimed, one of the nicest on all the various worlds. Jace had passed through marble-walled and lushly carpeted halls, kitchens capable of producing foods that nearly qualified as magic in their own right, libraries boasting any book one could ask for on any topic one might imagine. His own domicile was a suite of chambers, complete with self-lighting chandeliers that glowed without heat, a fireplace that never ceased burning and produced either warmth or cold depending on Jace's command. Even a few mechanical servants that were, if not as efficient or unobtrusive as Amara's animate dolls, still more than capable of accomplishing whatever menial task Jace might assign them. For the first few days, it was paradise, and Jace luxuriated in an opulence he'd never known. After 2 months of dwelling here, with nothing to do but peruse said libraries or wander about the streets of Ravnica, something he'd been quite capable of doing before the Consortium, thank you very much, he was ready for a change of pace. But neither Tezzeret himself nor the Ravnica cell's own leader seemed ready to actually let him do anything. That local lieutenant was an enormously corpulent, sausage-fingered fellow with untamed hair and a beard of darkest black, so short and squat that Jace briefly wondered if he might be one of the mythical dwarves he'd heard of on other worlds. Paldor was his name. Almost like Platter, he would say at every opportunity, hands clutching at one roll of fat or another. So really, could my parents have expected anything else? It was a joke nobody found funny, but that never stopped him from repeating it. He seemed a friendly enough sort, willing to show Jace around and introduce him to other members of the cell. But Jace wondered more than once just how black a dark side the man must possess to have worked his way so high in Tezzeret's ranks. But of course, Paldor's duties prevented him from spending more than a few moments on that project, and again Jace found himself left to his own devices. He couldn't really even go out to make new acquaintances on his own, for he didn't know how many members of the Ravnica cell knew about the Consortium's otherworldly nature, and he wasn't about to spill Tezzeret's secrets to the uninitiated. And so he lay on his back, and stared, and brooded, and fell into that state of half-sleep that comes so often when one lies abed with nothing important to do, and it took him several moments of trying to rouse himself to realize that someone was pounding upon his door. Chase took a moment to tug the worst of the wrinkles from his tunic, flung open the door, and found himself staring, or so it appeared, into a slightly warped mirror. "You'd be Jace," the man suggested. Jace blinked eloquently in response. "I'm Calist Roca, and you need to either learn to sleep more lightly or get yourself a doorbell, preferably one taken from a church steeple." Jace added, "We've been summoned. We're supposed to be in Paldor's office in, 5 minutes ago. So, unless your magic can either take us back in time or summon up a really potent excuse, I suggest we get moving." Still not entirely certain what was happening, Jace got moving. Although he'd long since mastered the ins and outs of the complex, he allowed the other man to lead and took the time to study his guide. Now that he was a bit more awake and a lot more alert, Jace realized that they did not look quite so similar as his drowsy senses had at first suggested. Calist was clad in black leather armor over deep blue padding, a match to Jace's own wardrobe in color, perhaps, but certainly not in style. The various blades that Callist wore about his person also indicated a wide gulf between their skill sets. Still, they could certainly pass as relatives, a fact that Jace refused utterly to dismiss as coincidence. Callist clearly knew the winding halls at least as well as Jace, since he hesitated not at all in his path to Paldor's office, on the uppermost floor of the highest building. Jace was vaguely irritated as he panted for breath at the top of the stairs to note that Callist wasn't even winded. The office, which Callist entered after giving a perfunctory knock, was massive but largely empty. A mahogany desk, quite broad but abnormally short to accommodate Paldor's stature, occupied the far end of the room. Several chairs stood scattered before it, arranged in a vague semicircle. On the wall above hung a large clock of brass gears and heavy pendulums. The rightmost wall was one large window, staring out over the slowly recovering expanse of Rumblefield, while on the leftmost wall was a peculiar contraption, smaller but far more complex than the clock itself. Tubes of glass twined over and about each other. Some seemed almost to be tied in knots, bending at impossible angles. Through those pipes flowed long wisps of... It wasn't smoke, exactly, for no smoke had ever been so unnatural a color. It took Jace long moments to recognize the ether of the blind eternities, for never had he seen so much as a puff of that stuff in the physical world. He couldn't begin to imagine what purpose the device might serve. But that was it, the entirety of the office. A great deal of space, with little purpose except, perhaps, to show visitors that Paldor could afford to waste a great deal of space. Paldor looked up from the desk, scowled briefly at the clock above his head, and then took several steps away from the desk. Today, he wore what Jace would politely have called a robe, and more honestly thought of as a tent. It was wine purple, and made Paldor look like a giant, bearded grape. "Welcome to your first assignment, Bellerin," he said. No response. It required a not-so-subtle ahem from Paldor to draw his attention from the peculiar contraption on the wall. Yes," Jace said. "Sorry." Paldor scowled, then shook his head. "You've heard the name Ronya Hassett?" "I've come across it. Who is she?" "The head of a merchant family who used to have connections with the Orzhov, and with whom the Consortium has had a great many dealings since the guilds went away. She's even dealt with Tezzeret himself a time or two. She doesn't know our true nature, or the existence of other worlds at all, for that matter. But beyond that, she knows as much of the Infinite Consortium as any outsider. Of late, more than a few of our transactions with her house have come up short. For a time, Tezzeret and I were willing to let it go. Most mercantile sects have one or two corrupt members, and she's done well enough by us in the past. But now she's claiming to have lost an entire payment, several thousandweight of gold in value. Since this happened at roughly the same time one of her relatives paid off an outstanding debt to certain criminal interests, well, you can see how this might arouse my suspicions." "Aroused?" Callist muttered from behind. "I'd say they were downright seduced." "Your job," Paldor told Jace, "should be simple enough for a man of your talents. We'd hoped to just have you meet with Hassett, read her that way, but she's refused any meetings for the next few days. Too busy, she says, and frankly, Tezzeret's not willing to wait. You'll accompany Roka into Hassett's home. He gets you into her house, you then get into her mind. If she's truly innocent and ignorant of these thefts, you'll return to me and I'll deal with it. If she's behind them, as I suspect at this point she must be, you tell Callist, and he makes an example of her." Jace frowned sharply. He'd known that working for the consortium would require what he preferred to think of as extra-legal activities. Hell, that was how he'd lived for years. But murder? His gut churning, Jace opened his mouth to object, or perhaps simply to inform Paldor that this had all been a mistake, that service to Tezzeret wasn't for him at all. The words wouldn't come. The fear of losing out on all the opportunities Tezzeret had promised, to say nothing of the far greater fear of what these people would do to him if he backed out now, formed a fist around his vocal cords that he could not shake. And so, feeling a new sickness in his gut that definitely wasn't fear, he nodded. "Callist's already studied the layout of Hesset Manor," Paldor told them. "You shouldn't have that much difficulty." Jace turned. "And you've chosen Callist in particular, since you have a swordsman who happens to greatly resemble your only mind reader. Or a mind reader who resembles your best swordsman," he added with a sarcastic smirk at Callist. "And you might just be interested in seeing how well they work together on a simple assignment, so you know if you can take advantage of the resemblance down the road." Paldor grinned broadly. "Now you're thinking like a member of the consortium. Now get moving." Paldor twisted in his seat and lifted an oddly shaped tube and funnel contraption from the wall. No magic here, but a simple speaking device, designed with perfect acoustics to carry his voice to the room beneath. "Captain," he said, grinning at Jace and Callist, "please have a pair of Hesset Estate servants' uniforms made ready for Roka and Bellerin." Jace didn't have to be a mind reader to tell, from the sound of Callist's groan, that he wasn't going to like the outfit. And that was pretty much that. They gave Jace half an hour to change into a horrible set of livery with canary yellow leggings and deep red tunic, and to gather what supplies he felt he might need, admonished him to trust his partner when he asked if he could have some time to memorize the layout of the estate, and then they were on their way. "I feel like a fruit salad," Jace said to Callist as they made their way out of the rubble field. "Tell me about it. I'm afraid to look down at my feet for fear of burning my eyes out of my skull." Silence for a time as the pair made their way toward the Hesset property. Jace found at least some relief in the fact that much of the district was middle class, so he and Callist weren't even the most garish people on the streets. "This operation," Jace commented as they finally approached the outer wall of the estate, "seems a bit half-assed. Wouldn't it have made more sense to wait for a more social opportunity to have me read Hesset's mind, rather than break into her house?" "Probably," Callist admitted. "Tezzeret's got a pouch of jade arriving in 2 days. Surprise shipment, something that another cell just got hold of. Other people outside the consortium have begun spreading rumors about our losses in dealing with Hesset's people. He really wants the matter settled, and blatantly so, before there's any risk of losing the jade to someone who decides these rumors mean we're vulnerable." "Got it." Then, exercising a sudden suspicion, Jace added, "I've never before met a planeswalker who prefers blades to spells." "You still haven't. I've worked with enough of your kind, Tezzeret included, to have a pretty good idea of what's really out there. But no, I wouldn't know a spell from a spittoon." And then they were there, and further conversation would have to wait. The outer wall of the estate proved no trouble at all. Jace cast his sight out and beyond the wall, watching until neither guard nor dog nor Drake was present. Once it was clear, Callist tossed a rope, enchanted to grab hold without need of a hook, and they were up and over, Jace somewhat less gracefully. "That's a handy trick," Callist whispered to him once they stood within the grounds. "Maybe I should learn a spell or two." Jace's reply wasn't even a whisper. It sounded only within Callist's mind. "Perhaps you should." Callist started, gave Jace a look the mage couldn't begin to interpret, and led the way forward. Traversing the grounds gave them no more trouble than had the wall. Between Callist's trained senses and Jace's supernatural ones, they sensed the approach of any guard or beast and took appropriate cover behind one of the estate's various hedges or trees. Still, a pair of great hounds, tugging their keepers along by the leather leash, nearly discovered them. The topiary behind where they crouched might block the eyes of the men, but not the noses of the dogs. Even as Callist reached for his blades, cursing the inevitable racket, he noticed Jace muttering under his breath, and without the slightest pause, the hounds passed them by. When Jace answered, he spoke aloud once more. "Most people think of illusions only as sight or sound. It's harder to do smells, but if you know what you're doing..." Callist grinned. "You have got to teach me how to do that. But, try not to do that too often, all right? That mind-speaking thing is weird." The front door proved but a momentary obstacle. Callist fiddled with the lock as Jace kept watch, and while Callist seemed to be doing more cursing than actual manipulating, the device did eventually pop open with a dull snap. Jace allowed his vision to go unfocused, examining the door and the entryway for magical alarms. But if any were indeed present, they were of a sort he couldn't recognize. "Should it really be this easy?" Jace asked as they softly closed the door behind them. The other shrugged. "Well, I don't normally have someone with me who can see through walls or plug up dog snouts at 30 feet, he whispered, "so I'd expect it to be easier." A few moments passed as they made their way through darkened halls. "Should it really be this easy?" Jace pressed again, after the third hallway that boasted no guards at all. "No," Callist whispered with a sigh. "Probably not." The manor was fairly typical, as manors went. Lots of halls with many rooms to each side, nice carpeting, and fancy paintings in fancier frames. A collection of chandeliers, fireplaces, sweeping stairs, and dining tables that were all far larger than necessity dictated. The strong scent of rose petals wafted along the corridors, and Jace couldn't tell if it came naturally from the many vases that decorated the various mantels and shelves, or if a touch of magic were involved. The utter lack of dust or dirt, however, was certainly magical, since even the most obsessive maid could not have done so perfect a job. Once, and once only, Callist and Jace had to duck into a small alcove as they heard the footsteps of heavy boots approaching. They watched a trio of guards, all armed and armored as though they were truly knights marching to war, pass their shadowed shelter and disappear down the hall. Not a one of them bothered even to glance left or right as they walked their patrol. Jace and Callist shared a suspicious look, shrugged in unison, and continued down the stairs. Still, nobody interfered, and within a matter of moments, they found themselves outside what Callist swore was the bedchamber of Ronya Hesset herself. Slowly and steadily, he reached for the doorknob, only to freeze as Jace's hand latched onto his own. "What?" Callist hissed. "Don't you need to see her to get into her mind?" "Since I don't know her well, yeah," Jace nodded. "But I don't know. Shouldn't we oil the hinges or something? What if the door squeaks? Calist's lips quirked in a larval grin. Jace, as a thief, you make an excellent wizard. What? Tell me what you notice about this door. Well, it's heavy wood, crystal doorknob, opens inward. Oh. Yeah, oh. Why don't we just crack open the door then? Why don't we? Calist gently turned the knob, and then shoved swiftly to minimize the duration of any noise the door might indeed have made. It opened only a few inches, enough so that he could reach the hinges on the inside. But as it happened, the door didn't squeak at all. Far more slowly, he inched it open farther, until both men could look into the opulent chamber. Even in the faint moonlight trickling through the window, they could make out a towering wardrobe, a large canopied bed with silken sheets, and a form wrapped in the blankets. Ready? Calist breathed, barely even a whisper. Jace nodded. Please, he thought to himself, begged the multiverse at large. Let her be innocent. Then he and Calist could leave, and neither Ronya Hesed nor any part of Jace's soul would die tonight. Jace stared at the sleeping form, spent several nerve-wracking moments gathering his focus, and found himself strolling the byways of someone else's mind. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like or sharing this video with your friends. If you subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell, you'll be alerted whenever I upload new videos. If you have a topic you'd like me to discuss, feel free to let me know in the comments section below. Finally, if you'd like to support me directly, well, I've created a Patreon for this channel. If you like what I do and want to help me out, go check it out. A link to it will be in the description below. Thanks again, and have a great day.